Well, welcome back, everybody. Lesson 4 of 1 Corinthians. We're getting to be about a third of the way through, maybe a little more. We're glad you guys are with us. So we were just talking about, most of the time we just encourage you guys, once you've spent some time connecting, to, as you get back into the passage and back into the workbook itself, to just kind of remind people where we are. This is a long 16-chapter book, and we're almost to the end of the first part, not the first half necessarily. So if you remember, you can divide the book into 2 parts. The first, Paul's responding to the reports that he's heard, and that's basically chapters 1 through 6. And he's heard about their divisions and their disorder. So we're finishing that up to in this lesson, but then we're starting into the second part of the book, which is he's responding sort of topic by topic to a letter that they wrote to him. And so we'll start that in this lesson as well. But one of the things that Trey and I were talking about earlier today was, as we move into this section and through the end of the book, actually, these topics are going to get personal for a lot of people in our groups. And so we would just really encourage you guys as leaders to be super prayerful and ask for the Spirit's almost divine glasses and lenses to see maybe where some of the people in your group, where these topics may be hitting home for them. These things are very personal, talking about your body, talking about your sexuality, marriage, singleness. This lesson especially has a lot of things that are right below the surface in a lot of people's lives. And so we just encourage you, see yourself as a shepherd of your people. You're caring for them. You're understanding their weaknesses and their burdens and their brokenness even. And maybe just really ask the Spirit to lead you in that.
Carol and I were talking, and I admittedly was thinking, all right, here's all the topics we're going to cover, and thinking through the different components and the skills of the week. And it was Carolyn kind of reminded me, this lesson is going to trigger some things for some people. And so, there's nights every semester where I think I got a plan, and I'm going to work the plan as a Bible study leader. And this is probably one of those nights where you have a plan, but have a very loose hand on that plan, because someone sharing something or a verse may trigger kind of a conversation that you didn't necessarily plan on, and is not an interruption to what the Lord is going to do tonight, but it may be the very unworking of what the Lord is going to do, and unpacking something in a context of community to kind of wrestle through it. So kind of as Carolyn was just saying, have a prayerful disposition, have open hands, have a plan, but be willing to throw it in the trash within 5 minutes if the Spirit's just going to take the conversation a different place. And that's not a failure, but that's just meeting the moment and really being attentive to where people are. So I do think this lesson has a great potential to really kind of get to a deep place, and a good way to really work some things out for people and have a context to safely process that. So we're going to try to do our best to guide you through it, kind of give you some ideas along the way as we kind of go through our normal progression. But as we jump in, you're going to kind of see off the top, it's kind of funny to kind of go from a shepherd's heart to connecting words as the observational skill. I don't know how to make that jump.
Your English teacher.
Yes, but that's what we got today for you. So as you kind of jump in, this is a week where I, even more than normal, kind of have highlighted, crossed, and have colors going on in this lesson. And so there are slogans to identify. There's connecting words here to identify. There's repeated words to find out. And so I love the first opening skill, though, of connecting words, because we do a lot of work week in, week out, video after video, of trying to help you trace the flow of the writer's thought. And especially when we're in Pauline literature, tracing his thought is as easy as it is in any other literature, but also those connecting words that we're going to teach you, from comparison, contrast, purpose, and result, are going to be like signposts that help you route around wherever Paul is going. So he's going to give you a statement, and then he's going to hit you with a but, like a big contrast to say, you've heard it said this, or here's a Corinthian slogan, but however, let me clarify for you a different understanding. And so those are going to be giant signposts, in a sense, not just the flow of the writer's thought, but ultimately kind of the ideas he's really trying to drive. Sometimes he'll make a statement and then he'll say for. So he's going to give you an explanation to help prove or explain what he just said or what he was trying to prove. And so those connecting words, we gave you part 1 this week. We'll give you part 2 next week. I've just found, for me, they're really helpful and insightful. I'll mark them up. I'll box them as I go through a lesson to kind of help understand how is the writer moving through and how is the argument developing. And so I've always found them historically really, really helpful. One of the first things I do as I study.
So good. Yeah. I agree. I think another thing that we continue to pull threads through is looking for some of those repeated words. And so we had you guys highlight a very much repeated word, body. The name of the lesson is bodies. So that would be something, just to again point out. This helps people understand what is the topic and what is the theme. And another one we were talking about that I found is there was 4 times in here it said, do you not know? Do you not know? It was in 9, 15, 16, and 19. And again, it's finishing up this section where Paul, the exasperated father, is just saying, guys, do you not know? Don't you remember? And so again, the tone, some of these phrases, it just kind of helps you to sink into what Paul's trying to get at.
It's great. As we jump into interpretation, there's a lot here to kind of sort through and kind of wrestle with. And really, as we kind of open up this section, we kind of began in verse 9 of chapter 6, but verses 9, 10, 11 are a bit of a hinge between the section we looked at last week and this section. And so it's kind of a hinge because it kind of connects the two and is going to be utilized both to explain what Paul had just been talking about with lawsuits and things in the previous lesson, but then to kind of pivot and to kind of be in the background as he's about to talk about sexual integrity and kind of how we handle our bodies. And so how did you see what Paul was doing as kind of a motivation for holiness in those first opening verses?
Yeah, it felt like to me that the big contrast that he's making is between the unrighteous and all the things the behaviors that typically characterize the unrighteous with the righteous, the ones who have the righteousness of God in them. And one of the things and so that's the big contrast. He's saying, this what were some of you. This is what you used to be. This is who you once were. But not so now. So a couple cross references that may help you out. He says this to other groups of Christians that he writes to. So in Galatians 5:21, something very similar. And also in Ephesians 5:5, he's saying, don't commit sexual immorality, greed, lust, all these things, because you will not inherit. People who do these things will not inherit the kingdom. So as we think of that phrase, it's actually been in here a couple of times. You may get that question in your group. What does Paul mean by will not inherit the kingdom? Trey, how would you answer that?
Yeah, I think, what's interesting is a couple lessons ago, we spent a lot of time talking about eternal rewards, that faithful sacrificial living leads to a reward, whether it's God's approval of the judgment seat of Christ or whether it's the opportunity to rule and reign with Jesus. And so we've spent some time earlier in this book talking about eternal rewards, but I don't think that's what Paul is talking about here in this context. I think specifically he's saying unrighteous unbelievers don't receive heaven. They don't have an inheritance in the kingdom that's to come at all. And if that's true, then why does your conduct still mirror their conduct? If that's what's coming for them, then why would you continue to live like you once were and like they still are? Why is there no distinction between you and them?
Yeah, so good. I feel like, to sum it up, our new allegiance to Christ, the new kingdom that we're in, we should dispense with the old allegiance to the old idols, to the old culture, and be fully focused on Christ.
This is an interesting passage as we get into question 2, because Paul is going to hearken back to a series of slogans that were very familiar in the culture. Maybe it's because my wife is a former marketing major. I just pay attention to ads and marketing and the use of slogans and how they kind of communicate and draw in. And so the slogans that are here in verses 12 and 13 are going to be really significant because Paul is going to show not just a familiarity with the culture, that he understands how they think and how they speak, but he's going to hearken onto those because ultimately they also capture how they're navigating life within their physical body. And so in verses 12 and 13, we also, in the interpretive section, talked about comparing multiple translations. And honestly, I think it's really, really helpful here because in the NAS, which is what we type in the packet for you, you're going to see verses 12 and 13 without quotations. You have no idea necessarily from the edited version of the NAS that these are quotes that Paul is highlighting. In multiple other translations, as I was looking at it, in the ESV, in the Message, in the NIV, and even in the Net Bible, you're actually going to see these slogans put with quotation marks to help it be clear for you that Paul isn't speaking his thought, but he's referencing their thought that he's going to then disagree with. And so particularly, if you look at verses 12 and 13, when Paul begins and says, all things are permitted for me, and he says it twice in verse 12, that's not his own thinking. What he's doing is he's highlighting something that they say that he's going to correct. Mm-hmm. And he's going to correct it two different ways in verse 12. And so keep in mind, as Paul is addressing this church with the divisions and the disorder that existed, there was rampant sexual immorality going on. So in chapter 5, we know of the case of the incest sexual relationship that's going on, that Paul is appalled that they haven't called out and judged, that he's astonished that they think is fine and they're not addressing it when even the Greco-Roman culture would have addressed it. But they haven't. And here we also know that because of the temple of Aphrodite, there were tons of Corinthian believers that were engaging with temple prostitutes and rampant sexual immorality. And so Paul is looking at that and looking at the church that's behaving just like the rest of the culture. And he's going to try to say there's something going on in their sexual ethic that is off. And he's going to do it in a couple different ways. In verse 12, he's going to highlight that they thought there was a sense of freedom that they felt they had as the spiritual elite, that they could live however they wanted to live. They bought into a moral permissiveness that was beyond what was normal or good. And so that's why he's going to say in verse 12, you may say, in a sense, all things are permitted for me. But then Paul's going to correct that by saying, but not all things are of benefit. Where you may think there's moral freedom, he's going to argue that not all things are actually beneficial or good for you. You may be free to do something in some theory, but in that theory, if it doesn't actually lead to good things in your life, it's not good. Or in fact, my favorite part, when he says, thinking of their own sense of self-freedom, he says, all things are permitted for me. This is what you may think, but I won't be mastered by anything. So it's possible to use our freedom in such a way that we actually lose our freedom, that we could engage in some kinds of activities that actually we think that we have freedom to do, but what we find is they actually end up controlling us. And within that activity, we're no longer free. What Paul's beginning to say here is there's a kind of conduct within the sexual realm that as we engage it, it's outside of the bounds of what God would call us to, and we know because it's not beneficial to us, and it actually leads us in slavery, not in freedom. It's really interesting the way the argument moves in verse 13 when he says, quoting their slogan or their line of thinking, when they would often say, food is for the stomach and the stomach is for food. However, God's going to do away with both of them. So they would say this over and over again. And what they were saying, in a sense, was they looked at food and sex in very similar ways. Both were satisfactions of a basic menial bodily appetite. And just like there was freedom to eat what you wanted and to manage food however you might choose, so there was freedom to handle sex however you might choose, because it's just an appetite to be satisfied. And what's really interesting is they argue here that God's going to do away with both of them. It was moving them in two different directions. Either God was going to do away with the body, so it was irrelevant what you did sexually, because he's going to destroy it anyway, so why does it matter what you do? Or in kind of their thinking that there was such an evaluation and an exaltation of wisdom and spirituality that was non-bodily, in which there's this idea of the spiritual life and the bodily life were separated, and God was going to do away with the bodily life. So live however you wanted to live was one thinking, or if he was going to do away with it, it was because it was bad. And couldn't be trusted. So the bodily appetites shouldn't be satisfied because we want to be spiritual. We want to be of wisdom and of our mind, and not attached to the demeaning appetites of our body that bring us down. And so they would kind of use these slogans to kind of move in two different directions. Either A, toward a moral permissibility, I could do whatever I want to do, or almost to an asceticism, another extreme, which was the body is bad, so don't satisfy it at all. And Paul is going to try to thread the needle to say, no, there's something dignified about our bodies and how we can use them. That doesn't mean we can do whatever we want, but it also doesn't mean that it's irrelevant however we live.
Yeah, so good.
What would you add to that?
Yeah, I think the view of the body that the Bible and this passage just illuminates is just the gift that it is. It's the dignity of the human body, and I think it's so easy in modern culture as well to do these same mind games with our body. It either doesn't matter, or I can abuse it, or I honor it, I worship it. We have so many disordered views of our body that I think by reading this and by meditating on it and thinking about it deeply, that hopefully it'll give us a better, clearer picture of how God actually created our bodies and what they're for.
I think it's kind of what the latter half of this section of chapter 6 tries to do. I think Paul is trying to recreate a healthy theology of the body.
Yeah.
And really the first card he plays, and this kind of gets into question 3, the first card he plays coming after this Corinthian slogan in verse 13 is to talk about the physical bodily resurrection that Jesus Christ has experienced, that we will as well. And so if Jesus' body was resurrected after the cross, and if we as his people will have a resurrected body one day, then God has a plan and a purpose for the body, that it won't be just done away with as if it's worth nothing, but God's going to resurrect not just our souls, but also our body. So as we kind of get into question 3, what Paul is going to do as we begin to think about how our parts of our body are union with Christ, he's going to kind of help us realize that when Christ has died and resurrected and we believe in Jesus, we're united with Jesus. And in that union, it's not just a union that's spiritual only in nature. It's not just that the immaterial aspects of who we are united with Jesus in that belief, but what Paul is going to say is that the entirety of ourselves are united with Jesus. Our body and our souls, that both of those become united with Jesus, because he's going to redeem them and restore both of them even in time. And so he's going to kind of, I think, develop here an understanding of our union with Jesus that is not denigrated to only one aspect, but is holistic in nature. And so when he talks about how our parts of our body are union with Christ, he's giving us a wholly integrated view. That means that what we do with our body is important, what we do with our soul is important, and that God is interested in both of those. He goes on further, he talks about how our body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. And what I love here as he begins to talk about the body as a temple, and he kind of also begins to talk about sex as well, to say that when the person is unioned with a temple prostitute, they're not just being unioned with their physical body, but in sex, there's also a holistic integration and union that's going on, that it's not just physical, it's not just an appetite of the body, but in sex, there's a union of the whole of ourselves. And so to think that we can be union with a prostitute in sex and think it's just a bodily moment, we're missing what sex is as well. And so I think Paul is looking at our union with Christ, looking at what sex is, and he's beginning to redefine them for the Corinthian church, to see them as much more holistic and integrated of both the material aspect of us and the immaterial aspect of us.
So good. I love the concept of our bodies being the temple of the Holy Spirit. He's playing on that temple prostitute. We're the temple of the Holy Spirit. And, temples in the ancient world were where the deity dwelled. That's, if they had an idol in it, that was the reflection of the deity. And so we as believers now, the image bearers, we are the reflectors of God. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And that kind of gets us into question 4. So he exhorts them. So you are bought with a price. Glorify God in your body. We've got a lot of cross references here, but a way that I was thinking about maybe approaching question 4 would be to not just brush over the word glorify. I think it's one of those Christian words that we throw around a lot, and, glory to God and glorify and all of that. And you might want to take a moment and just make sure that everybody is kind of on the same page about what it means to glorify God. And then looking at the cross references, in what ways. So I loved the definition that I found that said to glorify means to cause the dignity and worth of someone or something to be acknowledged. And that's what our great job as image bearers is to is to cause God's worth to be acknowledged by what we actually do with our bodies every day. And so as you look through these cross references, you might ask people to pick, read a couple, but in the Romans ones, I loved it. It was like, present your bodies. So, Romans 12, we always present your body as a living sacrifice. What does that actually mean? It actually means to put something at someone's disposal. I was actually thinking of like, at Chick-fil-A when you say thank you and they say my pleasure, it's like, it was my pleasure to serve you. It was like I was at your service, and it was who I am, and that's how I presented my body. So, what are some of these things? Romans 6, we're told that to present our bodies as tools for righteousness, as the actual living things that God can use to bring His justice and righteousness into the world, as a living sacrifice for worship and service. 1 Thessalonians 4 talks about abstaining from sexual immorality by self-control and controlling your body and possessing your body. And then James 3 is taming your tongue. So we're holistic. Our bodies have many uses. And so we can glorify and use our bodies to dignify the worth of our Creator in all these ways.
I think as you think about question 4, there's also a place not to overdo it on diet and exercise, but I think sometimes we overplay the simple reality and the necessity of sleep. That we're integrated beings, and so if we're not taking care of ourselves, sometimes the most spiritual thing one can do is just get to sleep.
Yeah.
So raising a teenager or just watching just kind of different phases of life, that sometimes that sleep thing is really significant to just care for self and
Right.
have some rhythms too. So
Right, for sure.
question 5 takes us a whole different direction. So we've spent almost all of this interpretive time on chapter 6, and we have one question for chapter 7, but walk us through it.
Yeah. So, you may be like going, why did you guys do that? Because chapter 7 has so much in it, and that's really true. Again, you have freedom as a leader and knowing your group to just think it through. The question here, though, is trying to get at, like, what's the connection between these two sections? And really, what we saw was that basically, as Paul was dealing with the issues at the end of chapter 6, there were sort of an excess of freedom, of liberty, being a libertine, just like the people who just, think I'm free to do anything. The beginning of 7 shifts toward some of the report questions that he's gotten about, like, actually going the opposite and restricting the body within marriage, sex within marriage. So those are some of the topics that are going to be coming up. So again, Paul, the great pastor, he's set the foundation theologically. What is the body? What is it for? And now he's going to get into the specifics of the relationships and the ways that we use our body together. I again feel like this, as you talk about these things in question 5, to have your shepherd's heart ready, your glasses on for that. And we wanted to remind you of some of the resources that we actually have really for all of this lesson. So back in the spring, as you know, or some of you may know, our teaching pastors did a sermon series called In His Image, and it really dealt with some of the sticky issues of sex and gender. And one of the sermons in that series was on marriage and singleness. And I would highly recommend Todd Berkey's sermon that he preached here at our Anderson campus on marriage and singleness. He brought out some beautiful points that this question is getting at. What are the advantages and the challenges of being married and single. Todd is the pastor of our young adult singles ministry. He has a beautiful testimony of his own singleness. So those are some of the things. But two of the main points that I think this section is trying to bring out is one is that marriage and singleness or celibacy are both gifts from God. We know that because that's what it says in chapter 7, verse 7. And both point to something greater than themselves. Marriage and singleness are a temporary state. As we all know, in the seasons of our life, sometimes we're single, sometimes we may be married, sometimes those things change. But they both, whatever state you're in, and Paul says, be content with the calling that you have. But they both can point to something greater than themselves. So marriage, it points to the union of Christ and his church. So if you're married, the greater calling is not just your own marriage, but what it reflects. Again, that temple imagery. And then singleness, he'll say in what verse was that? Somewhere in chapter 7, that there's this ability to be single-minded and focused on the Lord and things of the Lord in order to please the Lord, as what a single can reflect that's greater than themselves. And so there's advantages and disadvantages. There's challenges in both married and singleness. But I think Paul, even 2,000 years ago, understood some of those things. And again, you're not going to have time to go into the depths of all that's in chapter 7, but pointing it out as kind of that beautiful piece that if someone would like to study more, they can.
That's great. I love that, Carolyn. Thanks for sharing that. As we kind of wrap up and we hit application, I would tell you, Carolyn started us here that of all the lessons and of all the times together, it may get real fast in the first 5 minutes. Or I would just tell you, in the cases you're trying to guide it, sometimes we kind of do observe, and then we do interpret, and then we do application, and not to feel like you need to keep all application conversations to the end.
Yeah.
They may just get sprinkled through, and you may be talking about sexual purity in the first 15 minutes and just go for it.
Yeah.
Let it be more organic, especially as you kind of walk through this. But what we try to do here in the application section was kind of give 3 different reflection questions that we thought would be good conversation starters. I'll tell you, the second question, depending on your group, depending on its history, may be better in terms of what steps are you taking to ensure sexual integrity. That might be better as kind of a personal thing to process. But questions 1 and 3 I thought were really good and really helpful and easy kind of conversation starters, no matter whether your group's been together for 3 years or whether they've been together for 3 weeks now. That no matter how much history there would be, that hopefully you can get to that space. I would also just tell you, as we kind of get to this level of topic and this sense of how personal some of this can be for people, maybe a good night to also break into smaller groups within your group. That for some people, sharing at this level of authenticity with the entirety of the group may feel really challenging and daunting. And so what it can be much easier is if you divide it up and kind of create smaller groups or pairings, then it can become easier to still kind of create a confessional environment or an authentic environment, but it not to feel so large and daunting for people. And so this can be a great week to have accountability partners. This can be a great week to break off into pairs and to process through the application questions and what people are learning and thinking. Maybe where you already sense there's some history and there's some trust with some people, maybe not a great week to do spontaneous accountability partners, but kind of be mindful as to who seems comfortable with who, especially for these kinds of topics. But what else would you add?
Yeah, I think that's great. Again, we're praying for you guys. We know that these subjects are real and deep, and we know that you'll be faithful to shepherd your group well. So thanks for being with us.